Good evening, family, and welcome to Black Wealth Wednesdays, an initiative of the Center for Black Progress being brought to you as an effort to overcome the racial wealth gap and start the long, hard journey to creating Black generational wealth. For today's episode, our inaugural episode, I thought it appropriate to talk a little bit to lay the foundation to understand the landscape in today's society and historically in which we find ourselves, examining some of the past structures and historical events that have led us to where we currently find ourselves today. We're also going to discuss some of the current day effects of different forms of inequality, different forms of prejudice and bias built into the American landscape. And it'll start to give you those questions about what we need to do to overcome them, right? So, just a bit more about this whole initiative. One of the biggest concerns that Black America faces is financial. One of the biggest tools and benefits of the current system of white supremacy, the current caste system, you guys are going to hear me use those terms a lot. So, one of the biggest benefits is this myth of meritocracy, this comfort, the illusion of security that being somewhat middle class gives you. You're making $80,000 a year, you're making $50,000, $60,000 a year, you might be okay. You have a home or you maybe rent somewhere, you have a nice little car, so you feel like you're doing all right. But people on the other side of the tracks have so much more. And that's not a bad thing until you start to examine why they have so much more, what the origins of them having more looks like, and what it looked like for you when both groups went through some of the same things. So, talking about creating generational Black wealth, it's important to understand where we currently find ourselves and what does the current Black landscape look like in terms of how much money we have, how are we doing, how good or bad are we doing. So I'm going to give you guys a few statistics, right? So the Black wealth gap, as of 2019, the median white household owns about $188,000 in household wealth. That actually accounts for 84% of all household wealth. Okay, 84%, no math major, but that's most of everything, right? So the median Black household owns about $24,000, which is 4% of all household wealth. And this comes from the survey for consumer finances in 2019. All right, so maybe if that's all it is, maybe it's not so bad, right? Well, when you start to look at the different categories of wealth, you see that there's a true problem, right? So real estate wealth, I should say. Whites' share of the $30.8 trillion in total real estate assets is 78%. Out of the 30 trillion, they have 24 trillion. Out of that 30 trillion, Blacks have 1.6. It might seem like, oh man, $1 trillion, we're good, but 24 versus 1.6, it's not cutting it. So Black homes are valued at $80,000 less than white homes on average. And as we start to talk about some of the historical reasons for why that is, it'll all start to make sense, right? So again, that's just a quick little primer on what today's society looks like, the financial landscape. This is going to be probably the only episode that is formatted like so. If you all saw the flyer, you'll see that typically we're going to be having expert panelists in areas like taxes, credit repair specialists, attorneys, investors, real estate agents, entrepreneurs. We're going to be talking to the people who know, because I know a little bit, but I know when I need to outsource. We're going to be talking to the people who truly know what's what in the game of creating Black generational wealth. And we're just going to start to pave that path, family. We're going to start to get at the root of everything that we need to do, all the access and information that we're typically locked out of knowing. We're going to start turning to our community and others, allies in our community, so we can get hip and get this bread rolling. So today, I want to start with, again, some of the foundations of the present day wealth inequality. And you guys bear with me because some of this stuff is a little hard to hear, but this is who we are as a country, like it or not. So we need to face those facts. America as a whole, until it really reckons with this dark history, with the original sin and everything that's followed, the country may never get to what it can truly be. So, Black America's share of wealth has increased less than 1 percentage point since slavery. All right, marinate on that for a second. 1865, January 1st, 1865 was when all black slaves were emancipated, right? In more than 150 years since then, we've basically not moved at all. Why is that? So let's go back to this falsehood of the great American meritocracy, right? Let's just say that for 150 years, fully half of all black Americans really are lazy, not wanting to work, only wanting to spend their money on flashing and flossing and flexing on people and just looking for government handouts, right? Or they're just too busy shooting up each other in the streets. You know, that whole black on black crime thing is a real epidemic, right? So let's just say, I mean, again, 50% is very, very generous. What about the other half? What about those people who work 12 to 18-hour days for years and years and then they still have nothing to show for it at the end of their life? What about all of the people who actually have started businesses? The statistics don't work out, is my point, right? There's no logical way that for 150 years, a whole race of people have not been able to do anything, no matter the highs of the culture, the people who were at the tip top leading the race, to the people at the lowest parts who were struggling to get by and engaging in less than desirable activities. There's no way that in 150 years we should have moved less than 1 percentage point. So another part of what we're going to be discussing is this whole bootstrap theory, right? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. A little elbow grease, a little hard work, you pitch in. If you get off your butt and do something, you might be able to achieve something. Lift yourself up. It's a free market economy. It's the great American dream. It's available to everyone equally, right? We'll see. So let's now start to talk about, let's look at the other side. Let's look at the programs that 110% benefited white society. And again, the goal is not to center white people or white Americans or white culture as the great villain, but unfortunately, that is the role that this country placed us in historically, right? Black and white are at two opposite ends of the spectrum, the top and the bottom. So a lot of discussion about what's wrong with America naturally centers on the interactions and the differences and disparities between these two groups. So let's take it back to early times in the US, right? Again, these are programs and government mandates and different things that set up white wealth as we know it today. We'll see just how much pulling by the bootstraps white America has done to get to where they are today. I'm not saying that there's no white person who's ever earned a living, but I digress. Number one, the Head Right program. This is a program by the U.S. government in the early 1600s. It gave white male heads of households that came from Europe 50 acres of land and the tools with which to work it. Sound a little familiar? A little bit, right? Kind of sounds like what they denied us as far as the 40 acres and a mule. More on that later. So next up, we're going to jump all the way up into the Homestead Acts of 1862. This is where the government bequeathed 240 million plus acres to white families for almost nothing, right? There's an estimated 20 to 50 million white descendants still living on this land in the U.S. to this day. So again, 20 to 50 million people still living on that land that benefited from that exclusionary government program. Next, we talk about VA loans and GI Bills. These largely excluded black veterans for the first several decades in which they were created. Same thing goes for the New Deal. They excluded almost all blacks from programs. Social Security, that program excluded 8 out of 10 black people for the first 20 years it was in existence. This was because there was a labor profile clause that stated something along the lines of if you were a laborer or a domestic worker, you could not take part in this program. Plot twist, almost 80% of black people were in those labor categories, thanks in large part to the remnant effects of black codes about which said that they could not occupy certain occupations because they were above their station. So in essence, the black codes are a relic that came about as a response to Reconstruction gains that it seemed like black people were getting. A lot of states around the country instituted these black codes to essentially tie black people as closely to their former status as slaves as possible. So all of these programs, here's the real kicker. These are government programs funded by taxpayer money. Black people paid taxes, right? And these programs were created from money from black pockets, but the black people could not take part in the programs. So I want y'all to think about this whole concept of reparations as we go through this. Our nonprofit has big plans as far as reparations goes in the future, okay? I'm going to go ahead and say it here that it is the defining political topic and cause that every single black person should be behind and should push to the top of the agenda. The more that you understand about the current level and the historical interactions between the government and the states and local and federal levels in pertaining to economics, you'll start to see that we're not going to be able to get ahead without a huge infusion of some type of benefit, some type of cash to equal everything that white America benefited from for centuries. Okay? It's not as simple as saying pull yourself up by your bootstraps when the very people telling you to do that didn't have to take their own advice. All right, so those, again, the Head Right program, the Homestead Act, VA loans and GI bills, the New Deal, Social Security. So in summary, these laws make it clear that white America has never had a problem with big government, as long as they were the only ones or the main ones benefiting from it. But some of you may be familiar with the Southern strategy of Nixon. His campaign in the 60s is what forever stamped government aid as excessive, evil, mostly because it went to blacks and other minorities who, we were labeled leeches and welfare queens. This is dog whistle politics at their finest, and this is also the era that came about. All right, so we looked at the effect on white people. What about U.S. national and state policies that have impoverished black people specifically? So we're talking about direct actions by state and local and federal government that have led to black condition today in terms of where we find ourselves so far behind in wealth, right? Number one, and again, guys, this is not meant to be a completely exhaustive list. There's so much more. There are books upon volumes written that far exceed anything I can do in my few humble minutes that you're sharing with me tonight. So number one, which in my opinion, this is probably one of the biggest finesses of white America and the government against black people. Redlining, right? This is a practice that originated in Chicago in the 1920s. It's a series of restrictive racial covenants and ethics code provisions that made it illegal for buyers to disrupt the racial makeup of the neighborhood without facing serious penalties. That meant that it was illegal for brokers and homeowners themselves to sell to black families, right? So this was a regional practice that then became federal law and then national policy, all right? The National Association of Real Estate Boards adopted this rule as well. And they're the ones that really put the full weight of the real estate industry behind it. So when we talk about systemic and institutional racism, these are the sources. These are the origins of these things. They exist today, but this type of thing was on a large scale. So many people see racism and white supremacy as a few racial epithets or N-words and KKK. They see this whole, I call it the comical, overly visible version of racism. That's just one arm of it. The real insidious part is the gift that just keeps on giving, the part that operates under the surface without making hardly a ripple, the part that convinces you that the people at the bottom of society are there because they place themselves there and they keep themselves there, right? So this whole practice, the crazy thing about it this simultaneously created suburbs and ghettos, right? And let me tell you why. The Federal Housing Administration, FHA, a lot of people know about FHA Loans, Veterans Affairs, the VA, and the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation all colluded to make this happen. When we talk about it becoming federal law, they colluded to exclude blacks from these taxpayer-funded programs. Again, black people paying taxes and not being able to benefit from the benefit of their own tax money, right? If that alone isn't a reason for reparations, I don't know what is. So the strongest tool in this system was the FHA's requirement for an unbiased federal appraisal of a home's value, which also included a rating of the neighborhood. Black neighborhoods automatically got the lowest score, and they were coded in red, which is where redlining comes from, because they put together maps, geographical mapping of all of these areas and neighborhoods, and you just saw it bleed in red when it came to anything that black people touched. Make it so bad, the next lowest score that you got from, I think it was a 4, then you got a 3. A 3 indicated neighborhoods in danger of becoming black. So, man, listen, for 3 decades, these policies were not just legal, they were stamped and co-signed as federal policy. When the Fair Housing Act was eventually signed in 1960, the government still didn't put any enforcement policies in place until about 20 years later, right? So a lot of people that may know a little bit about how government works, how laws work, you can put policies in place, but there have to be enforcement mechanisms. If not, what are the consequences for people breaking the law? So enough on that. Some of the bad effects that this ended up having was on 2 huge institutions, black businesses and black banks, right? So this ultimately handicapped black banks because the devaluation of black homes, remember I told y'all, even to this present day, homes are $80,000 less in value than white homes. There's even a story a while back, I wish I could think about it right now, where an interracial couple, black woman, white man, they removed any signs of the fact that a black woman lived there. And originally, before they did that, the home was valued at, I think it was $230K or something. And then once they removed all traces of any blackness, the value was almost $100,000 more, something like that. So again, blackness just has that ring to it, right? That ring of that stigma of less than. So black banks are hurt because homes and holding the assets of homes and real estate and lending, this is some of the biggest activities that any bank engages in, right? So when you are dealing in this asset class and it's heavily devalued and your primary consumer base are the people that have these devalued assets and you're dealing with them, it's a lose-lose situation, man. The condition of black banks deserves a whole separate study on its own. I may do that because it's something that I'm so passionate about, banking black and buying black. But the banks were hurt, right? Blacks are in poverty, and so they're working with banks who are trying to lift them out of poverty. But because of the level of devalue assets or the level of not owning enough or, enough value assets, it just kind of has, I'm getting confused talking about it. It ends up having a self-fulfilling effect of keeping everyone down, the banks and black people included. So all that to say, there is definitely reason and need for banking black, but that alone, anything without a coordinated attack on at least 20 other fronts when you're talking about confronting and deconstructing white supremacy is going to be insufficient unless you do have that coordinated attack. So let's talk about black businesses, right? I'm just give you a little checklist from a man named Abram Harris. He was a prominent 1930s economist, and he listed all the barriers that pre-Civil War or antebellum black businesses face. And I want y'all to note how many of these problems black businesses still face today, for my business owners out there or anybody that's in the know. Number 1, the most difficult thing was the difficulty in obtaining capital and credit, right? Number 2, low wages and competition for jobs and immigration. 3 was mob violence. Thank God that that's not quite the case anymore. Number 4 was occupational restrictions. Again, these black codes. You can't be nothing other than a laborer, a field hand, or a domestic worker. Don't you dare be a shopkeeper or someone in manufacturing, right? So that's what that means. Number 5 was restrictions on owning certain property. Then the denial of the right to sue. We couldn't sue anyone in court. There were restrictions against us settling in the West. You know, the big gold rush, we weren't a part of that. And then finally, civic and educational handicaps. So black businesses specifically suffered during this time. There was, again, lack of capital. The banks were in trouble as well. To this day, they still struggle. So all of these policies, and we got to keep in mind that homes are typically the largest source of wealth of the average American family, right? And that appreciating asset, that appreciation in value, that you can buy a home for 300K, but then sell it for 500K, boom, you're suddenly flush with cash. So when we think about the average white American household owning about 188K in wealth, that's almost the perfect amount that shows you the source of that most likely came from home ownership or selling that asset. So listen, one of the biggest things we got to keep in mind as well when we think about wealth and how this country has responded to the gains, real or perceived, that black people has made, is that there's always been a consistent and ferocious white lash, a white backlash in response to any time black people make some progress. Let me give you some examples. So it's four big eras that we can talk about. Reconstruction, the period right after Civil War ended, the Civil Rights era, and then the election of Barack Obama and election of Joe Biden. Again, taking it back from way back to the current day. So in Reconstruction, you had slavery. Then you had the Jim Crow, which came about as a response to the ending of slavery. Like, all right, we can't hold y'all directly in bondage. Then we're going to make all of these laws to keep y'all away, but still keep y'all controlled, right? We also talked about the black codes, but there's also a string of white riots that was consistent for decades upon decades. And they specifically targeted black businesses. Some examples of those, you have the Civil War draft riots of 1863, which was Irish Americans mainly against black Americans, which was the largest race riot in American history. You also have the Colfax slaughter in Louisiana of 1868, where the sheriff of the town led a white mob to overthrow the local government in response to them having to change the names of the city and to basically start reforming that area due to the loss in the Confederate versus Union conflict of the Civil War. So they pretty much slaughtered half the town, took over the courthouse, and the sheriff was a part of it all. Tulsa, we know about Tulsa, Black Wall Street, bombed it up. Tulsa riots was actually the site of the first air-to-land bombing in world history. They dropped a stick of dynamite out of a plane on Tulsa. Okay, over 600 people died. Wilmington in 1898 was also another one, and then we have Rosewood in 1923. All of those, again, deserve a whole nother video series on their own. But this is just what we talk about white lash. And in all of these riots, one of the primary things that was destroyed was black businesses, okay, intentionally. And if not the businesses, then the people who were the most well-known and influential, a lot of times business owners and politicians. So I just want to talk a little bit about the Reconstruction era and President Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson probably did the most harm out of any president in American history. He gutted the Freedmen's Bureau that was set up to, aid in the Reconstruction and let black people start to get set up as real American citizens with parity. He gutted the bill that created it and the land that we were promised. 40 acres and a mule, that was a real thing. He came in after Abraham Lincoln got assassinated, said, nah. So the kicker is that he did all of this under the falsehood of that good old Bootstrap Theory, telling us that we should fend for ourselves, while at the same time, literally, the government was in the process of giving away millions of acres of land for railroad development, giving sweetheart plum deals, subsidies to private businesses, and also funding banks so that they could extend credit to the South. So again, taxpayer money going towards these things. That doesn't sound like bootstraps to me, right? That doesn't sound like the free market dictating everything. Johnson then welcomed traitorous Confederate secessionists back to the country. He pardoned them and gave them their confiscated land back that was supposed to go to the freed slaves that had lived and worked on and died on that land, right? So this is the first pattern of looking the other way of white America in the face of white terrorism and white assaults upon democracy and law and order. So we see that as also something that echoes to today. Man, listen, Right now, we've went from slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration to criminalization to fighting, to white people fighting and backlashing against affirmative action, to birthers, Tea Party, Trump, the alt-right, police brutality, voter suppression. Like it's always a response to any time that, hey, too many people showed up and put this black man in office as the president. Hey, too many people showed up. It was a stop the steal. President Trump is supposed to be the real president. So again, and now we're seeing the Capitol riot in response to that. We saw new laws being proposed across the country to try to prevent something like this happening again. Tighter voter suppression and registration. So it all is a cycle, man. So wrapping it up, guys, let's talk about the present day disparities, because again, we can always say, hey, that happened way back then, right? But how is it affecting you now? How is it connected? So as a result of everything, the exclusion from the federally funded programs that were created and distributed with our money, our taxpayer dollars, um, not to mention that this whole country became the capitalistic world power that it is due to slavery, 246 years of free labor, of which we were not allowed to benefit. We were not allowed to trade our time for money. All of that was illegal, right? So today we find ourselves where high income blacks during, let's say, the most recent financial disaster, which was the Great Recession, right? High income blacks were almost twice as likely as low income whites to receive those high interest subprime loans, right? So if they were financially, you did everything that society told you to do, the great lie. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. I got a good paying job. I got my family out the hood. We got a nice car, a nice house. I'm keeping my kids on the straight and narrow. Then why is it that they were still being victimized by like predatory, discriminatory lending? This is something that people don't talk about, because arguably the Great Recession of 2008 could have been prevented if it wasn't for racism. At least a small part, right? Again, I'm not an analyst. I'm not an economic advisor, but studying history and looking at the underwriting thing of who was the highest recipient of these faulty loans that ended up being the undoing of our economy, Black people and Latin Americans as well. Hispanic and Latin American. Yeah, I said it right. We were some of the biggest recipients of these things, even when we already had the money that said we should have gotten a better deal. The Center for Responsible Lending says that blacks lost between 71 to 92 billion dollars related to the subprime crisis. All right, and an organization called United for a Fair Economy says that this event was the greatest modern loss of wealth for people of color in modern U.S. history. There was no other time where we have had a bigger hit. And that's saying something, given everything I just read to y'all and that discussed with y'all. So look, here's the bad thing, man. These economic disparities, they also go over into becoming educational disparities. College access is way more difficult when families haven't been able to accumulate savings and they don't have a real estate asset or assets against which to borrow. So remember how I told you, you have to fight all of these different arms of white supremacy and systemic racism at the same time, because it's reaching into all these other areas, right? And it just doesn't stop there. So check this out. The National Post-Secondary Student Aid Study found that 60% of Black students' families had nothing to contribute to their college education as of 2012. This was up 20% from 2008, just prior to the recession. So more than half of Black families do not have the financial wherewithal to send their kids to college and contribute $1. Expected contribution is zero. Anybody that's done a FAFSA, you know what that means, right? So we go through these things and we have these experiences. You file your student aid, your financial aid, and you're doing these things, and it might not even trigger to you in your mind, dang, my family can't help me at all. Wonder why that is. You just keep it pushing, because Black people as a whole, we have a forward thinking, a forward momentum type of ideology, right? We go through so much and we're so strong. We're too strong sometimes, to the point that we don't stop and question and really do some work to investigate and fight and contribute to finding out why things are the way they are, and even trying to change them. So that's why we're here. That's why the Center for Black Progress is doing what we're doing. The old saying goes that when Wall Street catches a cold, Harlem catches pneumonia. So you can look at the stats any given time, even to this present day. Y'all can Google it right now. Whatever the countrywide unemployment is, it's usually double as bad for Black people. So if the national rate is 4%, it's 8% in the Black community. So again, everything is always going to affect us at a higher rate because of the shaky foundation that we have. And I'm gonna close everything out with this. And I'm going to tell you guys, please, to check in next week. I have an amazing speaker lined up, an amazing expert panelist who's going to be joining me. And we're going to make it all nice and fancy and pretty, make it nice to look at. I know y'all like my pretty face, but I'm going to give you some other cool stuff to see. So, ending quote here. The history of civilization shows that no people can well rise to a high degree of mental or even moral excellence without wealth. A people uniformly poor and compelled to struggle for even a physical existence will be dependent and despised by their neighbors and will eventually despise themselves. That's from Frederick Douglass. Family, take care. Start doing the work. Start learning the information, seeking it out, and please tune back in next week because we need to acquire wealth. We need to make it a thing, make it the new wave to leave a legacy for your family. Everybody wants to do it, but there are certain moves we need to be making that will prevent us from hustling backwards, right? And that's our whole point here. So again, y'all be blessed. We'll see you next week.